Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we journey through one of history's greatest family tragedies, the story of three brothers whose ambitions, betrayals, and secrets destroyed the most powerful dynasty medieval England had ever known. Over the next few hours, we'll discover how Edward, George, and Richard, three sons of York, rose together to claim the throne, only to tear their family apart from within. Before you drift into peaceful sleep, I'd love to hear from you. Don't be shy. Leave a comment telling me which medieval mystery fascinates you most, or simply say hello from wherever you're listening. And if you enjoy these calming historical tales, a like and subscribe would mean the world and helps us create more soothing content for you. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let these whispers from the 15th century carry you gently toward restful dreams. Edward, later known as King Edward IV of England, was born on a spring morning in Rouen, France, on the 28th day of April in 1442. He came into a world already fracturing with conflict, though the infant could not know that his life would be spent in warfare, that his reign would reshape England, or that his own family would become the instrument of their dynasty's destruction. The house into which Edward was born stood at the very heart of English nobility. His father, Richard Plantagenet, held the title of Duke of York, and through his veins flowed the blood of kings. Richard could trace his lineage back to King Edward III through not one, but two lines of descent, a claim stronger than the monarch who currently wore England's crown. This powerful heritage would prove to be both blessing and curse for young Edward and his brothers. Edward's mother, Cecily Neville, was known throughout England as the Rose of Raby, a woman of extraordinary beauty and fierce intelligence. From the powerful Neville family, she brought her own noble connections to the marriage, creating a web of alliances that would prove essential in the conflicts to come. Cecily was no mere ornamental noblewoman. She was her husband's partner in ambition, and she would raise her sons to believe in their royal destiny. In those early years in Rouen, as Edward took his first steps and spoke his first words, his parents were still loyal subjects of King Henry VI. His father served as the king's representative in France, attempting to hold on to the last remnants of England's once vast continental empire. But across the English Channel, in the palaces and manor houses of England, whispers were growing louder. King Henry was proving himself unfit to rule. Pious and gentle where a medieval king needed to be strong and decisive. 7 years after Edward's birth, in October of 1449, a second son arrived. Born in Dublin, where the Duke of York now served as the king's lieutenant in Ireland, this child was named George. From his earliest days, George would live in his older brother's shadow, always the second son, always watching Edward receive the attention and praise that came naturally to the golden-haired eldest child. George was handsome like Edward, blessed with the same tall frame and fair features that would come to characterize the York brothers, but where Edward possessed an easy confidence, a natural ability to lead that people responded to instinctively, George seemed always to be striving, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. This fundamental difference in their natures would later prove catastrophic. 3 years after George, in October of 1452, Cecily gave birth to a third son at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. They named him Richard, after his father. Unlike his tall, golden brothers, young Richard took after the paternal side of his family, smaller in stature, with dark hair and more delicate features. While Edward commanded rooms and George demanded attention, Richard learned early to watch and listen, to serve faithfully and await his moment. The three brothers grew up during a time when their father's relationship with King Henry VI was deteriorating rapidly. The king suffered from periodic bouts of mental illness, during which he became completely catatonic, unable to recognize even his own wife and infant son. During one such episode, Richard, Duke of York, was appointed protector of the realm, essentially ruling England in the incapacitated king's name. But when Henry recovered from his illness, the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, moved swiftly to remove York from power. Margaret was everything her husband was not: fierce, political, determined to protect her son's inheritance. She saw York's strong claim to the throne as a threat to her own child's future, and she worked tirelessly to exclude York and his allies from positions of power and influence. For young Edward, George, and Richard, these political machinations formed the backdrop of their childhood. They learned early that the world was divided into allies and enemies, that power could be lost as quickly as it was gained, and that their father's claim to greatness was contested at every turn. Edward, as the eldest, absorbed these lessons most deeply. By the time he reached his teenage years, he understood that their family would either claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, or they would be destroyed by those who opposed them. The breaking point came in 1455, when Edward was just 13 years old. His father, unable to accept his exclusion from the royal council and fearing for his family's safety, gathered his forces and marched toward London. At the town of St. Albans, York's army met the royal forces in what would later be recognized as the First Battle of the Wars of the Roses. The fighting at St. Albans was brief but brutal. York's forces won decisively, and several of the Queen's most powerful supporters were killed in the streets of the town. For young Edward, word of his father's victory must have been both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it proved the power of their cause. Terrifying because it meant there was no turning back. His family was now openly at war with the king they had once served. In the aftermath of St. Albans, a fragile peace was established. York once again became protector, but everyone knew this arrangement could not last. The Queen would never forgive the deaths of her allies, and York would never feel secure while someone else's son stood heir to the throne. The boys grew into young men during these tense years, learning the arts of war and politics, preparing for the conflict that everyone could sense approaching like a summer storm. Edward proved himself remarkably talented in martial pursuits. He excelled at swordsmanship and developed a keen understanding of military strategy. More importantly, he possessed a natural ability to inspire loyalty in men. Soldiers followed him not just because of his noble birth, but because they believed in him, trusted his judgment, and wanted to fight alongside him. These qualities would soon be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. George, meanwhile, developed a reputation for charm and cunning. He was quick-witted and personable, able to navigate the complex social dynamics of noble society with ease. But there was something restless in him, an ambition that seemed to exceed his abilities. He wanted to be important, to be powerful, to be recognized, and the universe's decision to make him a second son seemed a cruel joke he could never quite forgive. Young Richard attached himself firmly to Edward's side. He admired his eldest brother deeply, saw in him everything a leader should be. Richard learned to suppress his own ambitions, to find satisfaction in loyal service, to be the supporter rather than the supported. This disposition would serve him well in the years to come, though it would also lead him into moral complexities from which there might be no escape. The uneasy peace shattered completely in 1459. Queen Margaret, having spent years rebuilding her faction's strength, moved against York once more. The Duke found himself attainted, declared a traitor by Parliament, and his lands forfeit to the crown. Faced with royal forces marching against him, York made the painful decision to flee England. He escaped to Ireland, while his closest allies, including his eldest son Edward, fled to Calais. England's last remaining possession in France. This separation of the family must have been agonizing. Edward, now 17, and thrust suddenly into a position of independent command, found himself in Calais with his cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Meanwhile, his mother Cecily remained in England with younger sons George and Richard, relying on the protection of their status as a noblewoman and innocent children to keep them safe from the Queen's vengeance. For nearly a year, the York cause seemed lost, but Edward used his time in Calais well, working closely with Warwick to maintain the loyalty of the garrison there and to plan their return. Warwick, who would later earn the nickname the Kingmaker, recognized something special in young Edward, a combination of military skill, political instincts, and personal charisma that could perhaps achieve what the elder generation had failed to accomplish. The Great Return came in the summer of 1460. Edward, still only 18 years old, landed in England alongside Warwick and Warwick's father, the Earl of Salisbury. They marched rapidly toward London, gathering support as they went. The citizens of London, tired of the weak government under Henry VI, and impressed by the young nobleman's bearing and confidence, opened their gates to the Yorkist forces. With London secured, the Yorkists advanced north to confront the royal army. At Northampton, on a rainy July day, the two forces met in battle. What happened next would change Edward's life forever. Through a combination of superior tactics, betrayal within the royal forces, and sheer determination, the Yorkists won a complete victory. King Henry VI himself was captured on the battlefield, taken as a prisoner by the very men he had once trusted to serve him. Now came the moment of truth. Edward's father, the Duke of York, returned from Ireland and rode to London. There, in Parliament, he did something that shocked even his own supporters. He formally claimed the throne of England for himself. The legal argument was complex, resting on arcane points of medieval succession law. But the essence was simple. York believed his claim to the crown was stronger than Henry VI's, and he intended to take what he saw as rightfully his. Parliament, faced with this bold claim, reached a compromise. Henry VI would remain king for his lifetime, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his son, but to York and his heirs. It was a solution that satisfied no one. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, would never accept her son's disinheritance. York had risked everything for a promise of future succession that might never materialize, and young Edward could see that this agreement would inevitably lead to further warfare. Margaret proved Edward's instincts correct. She had fled north after Northampton with her young son, and there she gathered a new army. In December of 1460, word reached London that the Queen's forces were marching south. York, confident in his military abilities and eager to secure his position, rode north with a small force to confront her. He took with him his second son Edmund, leaving Edward in London. What happened next would haunt Edward for the rest of his life. At Wakefield, on the 30th of December, York's small force was surrounded and overwhelmed by the much larger Lancastrian army. The Duke of York was killed in the fighting, and his young son Edmund was captured and executed shortly after the battle. The heads of York and Edmund were placed on spikes atop the gates of the city of York, with York's head mockingly crowned with a paper crown. When news reached London, 18-year-old Edward suddenly found himself thrust into a position he had never expected to occupy so soon. He was now Duke of York, head of his family, and the leader of the Yorkist cause. His father and brother were dead, butchered by the Queen's forces and publicly humiliated. The message was clear. The Lancastrians intended to destroy the York family completely, to erase them from history as punishment for their ambitions. Edward's response to this tragedy revealed the man he would become. Rather than retreating in grief or fear, he moved forward with determination. While Margaret's army marched south toward London, celebrating their victory and growing daily in size, Edward gathered forces in the Welsh marches. He knew he had to act quickly, had to prove that his father's death had not broken the Yorkist cause. At Mortimer's Cross, on a cold February morning in 1461, Edward won his first major victory as commander. Before the battle, a strange atmospheric phenomenon occurred, a parhelion, causing 3 suns to appear in the sky. While his soldiers muttered nervously about this omen, Edward turned it to his advantage. He proclaimed it a sign from God, representing himself and his 2 surviving brothers, George and Richard. The 3 suns, he said, proved that heaven favoured the York family. His men, inspired by his confidence, fought with exceptional courage and won a decisive victory. But even as Edward celebrated at Mortimer's Cross, disaster struck elsewhere. In London, Warwick had been trying to halt the Queen's advance with the forces available to him. At the Second Battle of St. Albans, Warwick's army was defeated, and King Henry VI, who had been with Warwick's forces as a prisoner, was freed by his wife's army. Margaret's forces were now just miles from London, and it seemed the Yorkist cause might collapse entirely. London, however, refused to open its gates to the Queen. The citizens feared her northern troops, worried about looting and violence, and had grown fond of the Yorkist leadership. When Edward's army arrived from the west, fresh from victory at Mortimer's Cross, the city welcomed him as a saviour. In early March, Edward entered London in triumph, while Margaret's army, unable to besiege the city without supplies, withdrew north. Now came the moment that would define Edward's life. Meeting in London, the Yorkist leadership decided they could no longer continue the fiction of ruling in Henry VI's name. The agreement made with Parliament months earlier was void. York was dead, killed by the very forces supposedly loyal to Henry. On the 4th of March 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV of England. He was 19 years old. The proclamation of Edward as king was revolutionary in medieval terms. He was not claiming the throne through conquest or through Parliament's decision alone, but through hereditary right, arguing that his family's claim had always been superior to Henry VI's. This meant, in Edward's mind and those of his supporters, that he had actually been the rightful king all along, and Henry VI had been a usurper. It was a bold legal fiction, but one that his army was prepared to enforce. Margaret of Anjou was not about to accept this development peacefully. Her army, still powerful and supported by much of the northern nobility, prepared for a final confrontation. Edward, now king in name but needing to prove that claim through victory, marched north with the largest army he could gather. What followed would be the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. On the 29th of March 1461, in a snowstorm near the village of Towton in Yorkshire, the 2 armies met. Contemporary estimates suggest that perhaps 50,000 men fought that day, an enormous number for medieval warfare. The battle began in the morning and continued all through the day, with neither side willing to yield. The snow fell continuously, and men fought in near blinding conditions, unable to see more than a few yards in front of them. Edward fought in the thick of the battle, his height and golden hair making him a visible symbol for his troops to rally around. At one point, seeing his forces beginning to waver, he ordered his own horse killed, demonstrating that he would stand and fight rather than retreat. This gesture inspired his men to redouble their efforts. As the day wore on, the tide slowly turned in Edward's favour. By evening, the Lancastrian army broke and fled. What followed was a massacre as Yorkist forces pursued the retreating soldiers for miles, cutting them down as they ran. The nearby river ran red with blood, and for years afterward, local farmers would find bones when ploughing their fields. Estimates of the dead range from 20 to 30,000 men, an apocalyptic number that traumatized a generation of English people. Henry VI, Margaret, and their son fled north into Scotland, becoming exiles in a foreign land. Edward's victory at Towton was complete and terrible. He was now king not just in name but in fact, having proved his claim through the most decisive possible means. On the 28th of June, 1461, Edward was formally crowned in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent, designed to demonstrate that the Wars of the Roses were over and a new era of stability had begun. With Edward established as king, attention turned to his brothers. George, now 12 years old, and Richard, aged 9, had lived through the trauma of their father's death and the uncertainty of their brother's campaigns largely separated from Edward. Now they were brought to court, recognized as princes of the blood royal, second and third in line to the throne. Edward was generous to his brothers, as medieval custom required, but also as his nature inclined him. George was made Duke of Clarence in 1461, a title that carried extensive lands and revenues. The name Clarence itself was significant. It had been held by Lionel of Antwerp, a son of Edward III, through whom the York family claimed its superior right to the throne. By giving George this particular title, Edward was acknowledging his brother's royal status and potential importance to the succession. Richard, younger still, was made Duke of Gloucester in 1461. He would grow up largely in the household of Warwick, learning the arts of warfare and governance from the man who had done so much to place Edward on the throne. The boy was serious and studious, showing early signs of the competence and loyalty that would characterize his early career. Unlike George, Richard seemed content with his position, grateful for his brother's favor, and determined to prove himself worthy of trust. For several years, Edward's reign proceeded successfully. He proved himself capable not just as a warrior, but as an administrator. He worked to restore law and order after years of civil war, to rebuild the crown's finances, and to establish his authority over the fractious nobility. The great lords who had grown powerful during Henry VI's weak reign found themselves constrained by a king who would not tolerate challenges to royal authority. But Edward's kingship was built on a foundation of alliances, chief among them his relationship with Warwick. The Earl had been instrumental in Edward's rise to power, and he expected to guide the young king's policies. Warwick had a grand vision for England's foreign policy, centered on an alliance with France. He worked diligently to negotiate a marriage between Edward and a French princess, a match that would bring peace, security, and international recognition to Edward's regime. What happened next would fracture the unity of the Yorkist cause and plant the seeds of future disaster. In 1464, Edward was supposed to be hunting in the countryside. Instead, as the court would later discover, he was conducting a secret romance with a widow named Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth was beautiful, intelligent, and determined, but she was also a commoner by royal standards, the widow of a Lancastrian knight, and mother to 2 children from her previous marriage. When Elizabeth refused to become Edward's mistress, the king made an astounding decision. On the 1st of May, 1464, he married her in secret. For months, Edward kept this marriage hidden, even as Warwick continued negotiating with France for a royal marriage alliance. When Edward finally revealed the truth that autumn, the court was shocked. Warwick, who learned of the marriage only when Edward publicly announced it, was humiliated and furious. The marriage violated every expectation of how medieval kings should behave. Kings married for political advantage, for alliances with foreign powers, or to unite competing factions. They did not marry for love, certainly not to widowed commoners. Edward's decision suggested either remarkable courage in following his heart, or remarkable foolishness in prioritizing personal desire over political necessity. His contemporaries, and historians since, have debated which interpretation is correct. Elizabeth Woodville brought with her a large family, brothers, sisters, sons from her previous marriage, and Edward proceeded to advance all of them. Titles, lands, and advantageous marriages were arranged for the Woodvilles with what many established nobles saw as indecent haste. Elizabeth's father was made an earl. Her brothers received important positions. Her sisters were married to wealthy noblemen, sometimes to men who had been promised to other brides. This elevation of the Woodville family created deep resentment among the established nobility. They saw the Woodvilles as upstarts, as greedy relatives of a commoner queen, who was taking positions and wealth that should have gone to those with ancient noble lineage. Chief among the resentful was George, Duke of Clarence. The king's brother watched as the Woodvilles received favour after favour, while he, a prince of the blood royal and second in line to the throne, felt increasingly overlooked. George's resentment found a willing listener in Warwick. The Earl was furious at Edward's secret marriage, which had made him look foolish in his negotiations with France. He was angry at the Woodville family's rise, which diminished his own influence at court. Most fundamentally, Warwick was discovering that the young king he had helped create was not going to be the grateful, manageable figure he had expected. Edward had his own ideas about how to rule, and those ideas did not always align with Warwick's vision. In the mid-1460s, an alliance began to form between George and Warwick, built on shared grievances and mutual ambition. Warwick had two daughters, Isabel and Anne, who would be among the greatest heiresses in England when he died. George, ever conscious of wealth and status, began to see in Isabel Neville a potential bride who would bring him enormous riches and tie him to the kingdom's most powerful earl. Edward, however, refused to allow the marriage. His reasons were complex. Partly, he may have feared the combination of royal blood and Neville wealth that such a union would create. Partly, he may have resented the implicit alliance between his brother and Warwick, an alliance that seemed designed to pressure the king into policies he did not favour. Whatever his reasoning, Edward's refusal to approve George's desired marriage drove another wedge into the Yorkist leadership. By 1468, the situation at court had become tense. Edward continued to favour the Woodvilles, angering both Warwick and George. The king's foreign policy moved closer to an alliance with Burgundy, France's enemy, frustrating Warwick's French sympathies. And hanging over everything was Edward's failure to produce a male heir. Elizabeth Woodville bore the king several daughters but no son, meaning George remained heir presumptive to the throne. George, now a young man in his late teens, began to develop a sense of entitlement that would prove catastrophic. He was tall, handsome, charismatic, every inch the royal prince. He could see himself as king, could imagine that perhaps the throne should have been his, that perhaps it still could be his. These fantasies, fed by his resentment of the Woodvilles and encouraged by Warwick's subtle manipulations, began to consume his thinking. Meanwhile, young Richard was developing along very different lines. Now in his mid-teens, he had spent years in Warwick's household learning the arts of war and governance. Unlike George, Richard showed no signs of disloyalty or ambition beyond serving his brother the king. He seemed to understand that the stability of the realm required unity within the royal family, and he was determined to provide that unity through his faithful service. The break came in 1469. George, determined to marry Isabel Neville despite Edward's prohibition, slipped away from England and travelled to Calais, where Warwick waited with his daughter. There, in July of 1469, George and Isabel were married by Warwick's brother, the Archbishop of York, in a ceremony that was explicitly treasonous. They were defying the king's direct order. But marriage was only the beginning of the conspiracy. From Calais, Warwick and George issued a declaration criticizing Edward's government, particularly the influence of the Woodvilles. They accused the Queen's family of corruption, of leading the king astray, of damaging the realm for their own profit. The manifesto called for the removal of the Woodvilles from positions of power and for the restoration of proper governance. The declaration was a thin disguise for rebellion. Warwick had been coordinating with allies in England, and as soon as news of George's marriage reached home, these allies rose in armed revolt. Edward, caught by surprise, and with much of his army dispersed, found himself outmaneuvered. At Edgecote Moor, a royal force was defeated by Warwick's allies. In the aftermath, Edward's father-in-law and one of Elizabeth's brothers were captured and executed. Then came the most shocking development of all. Edward himself was captured. The King of England, who had won his throne through military prowess and held it through force of personality, found himself a prisoner of his own cousin and brother. Warwick brought Edward to Middleham Castle, one of the Earl's northern strongholds, and there the king was held under guard. It was an extraordinary situation, unique in English history. Warwick and George had captured the king, but they had not killed him and showed no inclination to do so. Their goal seemed to be to control Edward, to force him to govern according to their wishes. But medieval kingship did not work that way. A king held captive lost his authority, and without the king's legitimate governance, the realm began to fall into disorder. Over the following weeks, it became clear that Warwick's coup had failed. Local conflicts and uprisings began to break out across England. Warwick tried to govern in Edward's name, but without the king's visible presence and willing cooperation, his orders carried no weight. The nobility and commons alike were confused and alarmed by the situation. Even those who had grievances with Edward's government proved unwilling to accept rule by Warwick and George. By autumn, Warwick was forced to release Edward. The king returned to London, apparently reconciled with his cousin and brother. Edward, with characteristic pragmatism, announced a general pardon for those involved in the rebellion. But everyone at court understood that this peace was a facade. Edward would not forget this betrayal, and Warwick and George could not feel secure in a realm ruled by a king they had imprisoned. The fragile peace lasted only months. In early 1470, another uprising occurred, this one so obviously coordinated with Warwick that the Earl's involvement could not be denied. Edward moved quickly to crush the rebellion and summoned Warwick to court to answer for his suspected treason. Rather than face the king's judgment, Warwick fled to France, taking with him George and a pregnant Isabel. In France, Warwick performed one of the most astonishing political reversals in English history. He made an alliance with his former bitter enemy, Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen, whose forces had killed Warwick's father and brother nearly a decade earlier. Together, they planned an invasion of England that would depose Edward, restore Henry VI to the throne, and, most importantly for Warwick, put the Earl back in a position of supreme power. George went along with this plan, which meant he was now supporting the Lancastrian claim to the throne over his own brother's kingship. The betrayal was staggering. George was committing treason, not just against his king, but against his own family, against the cause for which their father had died. Yet George seemed to believe that his alliance with Warwick would somehow result in his own elevation. Perhaps Warwick had promised that George, married to his daughter, might rule as regent for the simple-minded Henry VI, or even that George might himself become king. The invasion came in September 1470. Warwick landed in the south of England with a small force, but his true strength lay in his reputation and connections. As word spread that the great Earl had returned, men flocked to his banners. Edward, caught off guard once again, found his support crumbling. Many nobles, tired of the conflicts and uncertainties of Edward's reign, chose to back Warwick's coup. Edward made the painful decision to flee rather than face Warwick's army with insufficient forces, taking with him his youngest brother Richard, who had remained steadfastly loyal throughout all these troubles. Edward escaped to the coast and sailed for the continent. They found refuge in Burgundy, where Edward's sister Margaret was married to Duke Charles the Bold. Back in England, Warwick achieved his goal. Henry VI was removed from the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned since Edward's victory at Towton nearly a decade earlier, and restored to the throne. The ceremony was pathetic in its emptiness. Henry was by now a broken man, simple-minded and disconnected from reality, capable only of serving as Warwick's puppet. But he was king in name, and Warwick ruled in his stead. George found himself in an awkward position. He had betrayed his brother and supported the Lancastrian restoration, but the rewards he had been promised failed to materialize. Warwick treated him as a subordinate, not as a partner. Margaret of Anjou, who arrived in England to join her husband, made clear her contempt for the Yorkist prince who had switched sides. And most problematically, George was still Edward's heir under Yorkist succession, but under Lancastrian law, he had no claim to the throne at all. Edward spent the winter of 1470-71 in exile, gathering resources and planning his return. Duke Charles of Burgundy, though initially reluctant to risk war with France by supporting Edward, eventually provided money and ships. Edward's natural optimism and determination impressed even foreign observers. This was a king who had lost his throne but not his confidence, a warrior who had been defeated but not broken. In March 1471, Edward landed in Yorkshire with a small force, numbering perhaps only 2,000 men. His situation seemed desperate. He was invading his own kingdom, which was now officially ruled by a restored Henry VI and defended by the powerful Warwick. But Edward possessed advantages that numbers could not measure: his personal courage, his military skill, and his ability to inspire loyalty in those who knew him. As Edward marched south, a crucial decision faced his brother George. Would George fight for the Lancastrian regime he had helped restore, or would he return to his family? Edward sent messages to George, appealing to their brotherhood, offering forgiveness for past betrayals. The messages worked, or perhaps George simply recognized that Warwick's regime was unstable and that his future lay with his brother rather than against him. Near Banbury, the two armies prepared to meet in battle. Edward commanded one force, Warwick and George another. But as the armies drew near, George made his choice. He left Warwick's force and rode to Edward's side, bringing with him several thousand men. The brothers embraced, and Edward publicly forgave George's treason. The moment was both touching and calculated. Edward needed every sword he could gather, and George needed a path back to safety. Warwick, shocked by George's defection, withdrew northward. The two forces finally met at Barnet, just north of London, on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1471. The battle was fought in thick fog, so dense that soldiers could barely see their enemies. The confusion led to tragedy. At one point, Warwick's forces mistook each other for enemies and began fighting among themselves. By the end of the day, Edward had won a complete victory. Warwick, the kingmaker, the man who had made and unmade kings, lay dead on the battlefield. The Earl, who had dominated English politics for more than a decade, whose ambitions had reshaped the kingdom, died in the mud outside London, struck down by soldiers he could not see through the fog. But Edward's challenges were not over. Margaret of Anjou had finally landed in England with reinforcements from France, bringing with her her son, Edward of Lancaster, the Lancastrian heir to the throne. She gathered an army in the West Country and marched toward Wales, hoping to gain more supporters. Edward, exhausted from Barnet, but unable to rest, pursued her with remarkable speed. The two forces met at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471. The battle was fierce, but relatively short. Edward's tactical genius and the superior training of his forces won the day. Edward of Lancaster, the Lancastrian prince, died in the battle or immediately after. Some sources say he was killed while fleeing, others that he was executed after being captured. With his death, the Lancastrian male line was effectively ended. Margaret of Anjou was captured and imprisoned. She would spend years in captivity before eventually being ransomed back to France, where she lived out her remaining years in poverty and obscurity. Henry VI, the simple-minded king in whose name so much blood had been spilled, died in the Tower of London on the night of May 21st, 1471. The official explanation was that he died of melancholy upon hearing of his son's death. Few believed this story then, and historians now generally accept that Henry was murdered, almost certainly on Edward's orders. With the Lancastrian royal family eliminated, Edward's position was finally secure. He had regained his throne through his own efforts, proved his worth as a military commander multiple times, and destroyed the opposition. The Wars of the Roses, it seemed, were finally over. Edward could now turn his attention to the work of rebuilding his kingdom and establishing his dynasty. The decade following Edward's restoration was the most successful period of his reign. The king, now in his early 30s, showed himself capable of the peacetime arts of governance as well as wartime leadership. He worked methodically to restore the crown's financial position, which had been devastated by years of civil war. He reformed the administration of justice, worked to suppress local violence and feuding, and gradually rebuilt the authority of royal government. Edward's approach to governance was notably personal. Unlike many medieval kings who ruled through intermediaries, Edward involved himself directly in the details of administration. He would personally hear legal cases, meet with merchants and townspeople, and travel throughout his kingdom to show himself to his subjects. This hands-on style of kingship helped build loyalty and demonstrated that Edward was not just a warrior, but a ruler concerned with the welfare of his realm. The king's family life also flourished during these years. Elizabeth Woodville bore him numerous children, 10 in total who survived infancy. Among them were 2 sons, Edward, born in 1470, and Richard, born in 1473. These boys, both named after their father and uncle, seemed to secure the Yorkist succession for generations to come. Edward showered them with titles and honours, making the elder boy Prince of Wales and preparing him from infancy for his future role as king. George, now Duke of Clarence, seemed to settle into his role as the king's brother. He held extensive lands and wielded considerable power, serving on the royal council and participating in the governance of the realm. He had children with Isabel Neville, including a son named Edward, which gave him his own line of succession. On the surface, George appeared to have accepted his position in the royal family, but beneath this appearance of contentment, George remained fundamentally unstable. He resented Edward's success, felt that he deserved more recognition, and continued to harbour ambitions beyond his station. His wife Isabel's inheritance, which had been one of his main reasons for marrying her, became a source of conflict with his younger brother Richard, who had married Warwick's other daughter, Anne. After the Earl's death, the two brothers quarrelled bitterly over the division of Warwick's vast estates. Edward tried to mediate between his brothers, but the dispute revealed the tensions that still existed within the royal family. George felt that his status as the elder brother should give him precedence, while Richard argued for an equal division based on their wives' equal status as Warwick's heirs. Eventually, Edward imposed a settlement that somewhat favoured George, But neither brother was fully satisfied. Richard, by this time, had established himself as a capable and loyal servant of the crown. Edward made him the dominant power in the north of England, where Richard governed effectively and earned a reputation for fairness and competence. Unlike George, Richard seemed genuinely content with his role, taking satisfaction in serving his brother and managing his responsibilities well. He and Anne had a son, also named Edward, which secured Richard's own line of succession. During these years, Edward's court became famous for its magnificence. The king enjoyed luxury and spectacle, hosting elaborate feasts and tournaments. He surrounded himself with beautiful people and beautiful things, spending lavishly on clothing, jewels, and architectural projects. This extravagance had a political purpose. It demonstrated the power and stability of Edward's regime, but it also reflected the king's personal inclinations toward pleasure and display. Edward's physical appearance changed during these peaceful years. The golden warrior who had won his throne through martial prowess began to show the effects of his lifestyle. He grew heavier, his once athletic frame softening with age and indulgence. Contemporary observers noted his increasing weight and his fondness for wine and rich food. Some chroniclers suggested that Edward's appetites extended to women as well, hinting at affairs and mistresses despite his marriage to Elizabeth. Yet despite these changes, Edward remained an effective king. He managed to keep England at peace, which was no small achievement given the realm's recent history. He carefully balanced the interests of different noble families, preventing any one faction from becoming too powerful. He worked to improve trade and commerce, understanding that a prosperous kingdom was a stable kingdom, and he prepared his eldest son for kingship, ensuring that the transition of power would be smooth. When his time came, George, however, was becoming increasingly erratic. In 1476, his wife Isabel died shortly after childbirth. George, devastated and unstable, convinced himself that Isabel had been poisoned. He accused one of her ladies-in-waiting, a woman named Anchoret Twinho, of murder. Without any legal authority to do so, George had Anchoret arrested, brought to his castle at Warwick, and subjected to a show trial where the jurors were intimidated into finding her guilty. She was hanged immediately. This act of vigilante justice was shocking even by medieval standards. George had essentially murdered an innocent woman based on his paranoid delusions. Edward was furious at this challenge to royal authority. Only the king had the right to execute subjects, and George's actions suggested that he considered himself above the law. The incident marked a turning point in Edward's patience with his brother's behavior. George then made matters worse by proposing to marry Mary of Burgundy, the heiress to the wealthy Duchy of Burgundy. Such a marriage would have made George one of the most powerful princes in Europe, with resources potentially rivaling those of the king himself. Edward forbade the match, seeing it as a threat to English interests and to his own position. George, once again, felt thwarted by his brother. The final straw came when one of George's servants was arrested for treason, specifically for spreading prophecies that Edward would soon die and be succeeded by someone whose name began with G. This was clearly a reference to George, and it suggested that the Duke of Clarence was once again plotting against his brother. When this servant was convicted and executed, George burst into a royal council meeting and loudly protested the verdict, implying that the execution had been unjust. This public challenge to the king's justice, combined with years of accumulated grievances and betrayals, exhausted Edward's patience. In June 1477, George was arrested and brought to the Tower of London. For months, he remained imprisoned while Edward apparently debated what to do with his troublesome brother. To execute a brother and a prince of the blood royal was a serious step, one that would shock the realm and might create sympathy for George among the nobility. Parliament convened in January 1478, and Edward did something unprecedented. He personally appeared before Parliament to accuse his own brother of treason. The king himself presented the evidence against George, detailing a long list of offences, spreading treasonous prophecies, undermining the king's justice, circulating documents that claimed Edward was illegitimate, preparing to flee England and foment rebellion from abroad. The charges painted George as a habitual traitor, someone who had betrayed his brother and his family repeatedly. The Bill of Attainder, the legal document that declared George guilty without the need for a trial, described his actions as unnatural and loathly treasons. Unnatural because they were committed against his own brother, loathly because they threatened the peace of the realm. No one in Parliament dared speak in George's defence. The Duke of Buckingham, as High Steward of England, formally pronounced the sentence of death. George, Duke of Clarence, was condemned to die, but the method of execution was left unspecified, which was unusual. Normally, noblemen convicted of treason were beheaded, but the sentence against George did not specify beheading or any other particular method. For several days, nothing happened. Edward seemed to hesitate, perhaps hoping that Parliament would ask him to show mercy to his brother. But no such request came. The nobility had learned from years of conflict that showing sympathy to traitors, even royal traitors, could be dangerous. They waited for the king to act. On the 18th of February, 1478, George, Duke of Clarence, died in the Tower of London. The death was private, conducted away from public view. No official announcement was made about the method of execution, but within days, a rumour began to spread through London and across England. George had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. The story was so strange, so perfectly suited to George's character, that it immediately captured the public imagination. George had always been fond of wine, some said too fond. The idea that he might have been executed by drowning in his favourite drink seemed like a dark cosmic joke, a fitting end for a man whose appetites and ambitions had brought him to ruin. Was the story true? Modern historians debate this question. Some argue that the tale was invented later, perhaps as a morbid joke about George's fondness for drink. Others point to evidence suggesting that something unusual did happen during George's execution. The traditional method of beheading was not used, as later examinations of bodies believed to be George's showed the head still attached. Some form of private, unusual execution seems to have occurred. A butt of wine was a large barrel, holding approximately 105 gallons. It would be more than enough to drown a man, and the fumes alone from an open barrel of strong wine could render someone unconscious. The method, while bizarre, was theoretically possible, and for a king who wanted his brother's death to be private, but who also perhaps wanted to avoid the symbolism of spilling royal blood, drowning might have seemed an appropriate compromise. George's daughter, Margaret Pole, would later wear a bracelet with a charm shaped like a wine barrel, which some historians interpret as a memorial to her father's unusual death. This detail, while not conclusive, suggests that the wine barrel story may have been believed by George's own family. Whatever the truth about the method, the fact of George's death was undeniable. Edward had ordered the execution of his own brother, an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Contemporary sources suggest that Edward came to regret the decision, that he blamed Parliament for not urging him to show mercy, that he felt guilty for allowing family conflicts to end in such a terrible way. The execution of George, Duke of Clarence, marked the beginning of the end for the Yorkist dynasty. Edward had removed the greatest threat to his rule, but he had done so by demonstrating that family bonds meant nothing in the face of political necessity. This lesson would not be forgotten, and it would have terrible consequences in the years to come. The The 5 years following George's execution saw Edward at the height of his power, but also saw the beginning of his decline. The king, now in his late 30s, was increasingly showing the effects of his lifestyle. His weight continued to increase, and contemporary observers commented on his changed appearance. The handsome warrior king was becoming a corpulent middle-aged man, his former athleticism buried under layers of fat gained from years of rich food and relative inactivity. Edward's health began to suffer as well. He experienced periodic illnesses, though their exact nature is unclear from medieval sources. Some historians speculate that he may have had diabetes, given his weight and symptoms. Others suggest that he suffered from the effects of years of campaign life, old wounds, exposure to harsh weather, the accumulated stress of warfare and rulership. Yet Edward continued to govern effectively. He maintained his personal approach to kingship, travelling his realm and involving himself in administration. His relationship with Elizabeth Woodville remained strong, and she continued to be influential in court politics. Their children were growing. The eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, was being educated in Ludlow Castle, learning the skills he would need as king. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, remained Edward's most trusted servant. The younger brother had proved himself repeatedly as an administrator and military commander. He governed the north of England with a firm hand, maintaining order and defending against Scottish raids. Unlike George, Richard seemed to have no ambitions beyond serving his brother faithfully. Edward rewarded this loyalty with continued grants of lands and offices. In foreign affairs, Edward achieved some success through diplomacy rather than warfare. He negotiated a treaty with France that brought him an annual pension in exchange for peace. This arrangement was controversial. Some saw it as clever statecraft that brought money without bloodshed. Others viewed it as paying England to stay out of French affairs. But Edward was pragmatic about such matters. He had seen enough warfare and understood that peace had its own value. The king also worked to secure advantageous marriages for his children. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, was seen as a valuable marriage prospect for various European princes. These negotiations, while they would ultimately come to nothing during Edward's lifetime, showed his concern for establishing his dynasty's position in the wider European royal family. But beneath the surface stability, problems were brewing. The execution of George had created factions at court. Some nobles had sympathized with Clarence despite his obvious faults, and they resented the Woodville family's influence over the king. Others worried about what the execution said about Edward's willingness to destroy even his own family members when they challenged his authority. The unity that had characterized the early years after Edward's restoration was beginning to fray. Edward's health continued to deteriorate through the early 1480s. He became ill more frequently, and the periods of illness lasted longer. His physicians, working with the limited medical knowledge of the time, could do little to help. Medieval medicine understood that Edward's lifestyle was harming him, but they had no effective treatments for what we would now recognize as the diseases of excess: obesity, possible diabetes, heart disease. In March of 1483, Edward became seriously ill. He had gone fishing, perhaps caught a chill, and developed what seemed to be a respiratory infection. His condition worsened rapidly. Within days, it became clear that the king was dying. Edward, only 40 years old but physically much older due to his lifestyle, faced his mortality with the realization that he had not prepared adequately for his death. Edward's greatest concern was for his children, particularly his 2 sons. The eldest, Edward, was only 12 years old, far too young to rule independently. The younger boy, Richard, was just 10. Both boys would need protection and guidance during their minority. More urgently, they would need protection from the factional conflicts at court. Edward knew that his death would trigger a power struggle. The Woodville family, led by the Queen's brother Earl, Rivers and her son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, would want to maintain their position by controlling the young Edward V. Other factions at court, particularly those who had resented Woodville influence, would try to diminish their power. In the middle of these conflicts would be Edward's sons, vulnerable and innocent. The dying king made crucial decisions about the succession. He named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm during young Edward's minority. This was a logical choice. Richard was the boy's uncle, an experienced administrator and military commander, and had proven his loyalty to Edward over decades. Edward believed that Richard would protect his sons and guide the young king until he came of age. Edward also worked to reconcile the various factions at court. He called together the rival nobles and asked them to swear to maintain peace after his death, to work together for the good of the realm and the young king. In his final days, Edward tried desperately to ensure that the conflicts he had navigated during his reign would not tear the kingdom apart after his death. On the 9th of April, 1483, King Edward IV died. He was 40 years old, had reigned for more than 22 years, and left behind a realm that was, for the moment, at peace. His body was prepared for burial with all the ceremony due a King of England. He would be laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the burial place he had prepared for himself. But even as Edward's body was being prepared for burial, the careful arrangements he had made for his succession were beginning to unravel. The young Prince Edward was in Ludlow, far from London, in the care of his Woodville relatives. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was in the north, where news of the king's death would take days to reach him, and in London, the Woodville faction was already making plans to ensure their continued power in the new reign. Edward IV's death marked the end of an era. He had been the last king of England to win his throne on the battlefield, the last to prove himself primarily through military prowess, rather than through inheritance or political manoeuvring. He had brought stability to England after decades of civil war, had fathered a new generation of royal children, and had governed effectively for more than 2 decades. Yet his legacy would be overshadowed by what came after, by the chaos that would consume his family in the months following his death. Word of Edward IV's death reached Richard, Duke of Gloucester, in Yorkshire. The Duke's reaction combined genuine grief for his brother with awareness that a new phase of his life was beginning. Edward had named him Lord Protector, giving him authority over the young king until Edward V came of age. It was a position of enormous responsibility, but also enormous danger. Richard immediately began preparations to travel south and assume his duties. He wrote to the council in London, pledging his loyalty to the new king and announcing his intention to bring young Edward V safely to London for his coronation. Richard's letters expressed all the proper sentiments: grief for his brother, determination to serve the young king faithfully, desire to work with the council for the good of the realm. But as Richard travelled south, he learned disturbing news. The Woodvilles in London were not waiting for his arrival. Earl Rivers and Thomas Grey were making plans to bring the young king to London with a large armed escort, essentially presenting the council with an accomplished fact before Richard could intervene. More concerning, there were suggestions that the Woodvilles intended to dispense with the protectorate entirely, arguing that it was unnecessary given that Edward V, though young, was capable of ruling with their guidance. Richard understood the implications immediately. If the Woodvilles succeeded in establishing control over the young king before Richard reached London, the protectorate Edward IV had established would be meaningless. Richard would be shut out of power, and given the Woodvilles' long-standing hostility toward those who had opposed their rise, he might even face danger. At Northampton, Richard intercepted Earl Rivers, who was escorting young Edward III from Ludlow to London. The meeting began cordially enough, with all parties expressing loyalty to the new king and determination to work together. But that evening, after a friendly dinner, Richard made his move. Earl Rivers and the other Woodville escorts were arrested and placed under guard. The next morning, Richard rode to meet Edward V. The young king, confused and frightened by the arrest of his uncle and companions, was told that his Woodville relatives had been plotting against the Protector and the good governance of the realm. Richard pledged his loyalty to Edward, explained that he was acting as the boy's late father had wished, and took personal charge of the journey to London. In London, news of these events caused panic among the Woodville family. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, recognizing the danger, fled with her younger son Richard and her daughters into the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. Medieval sanctuary was a powerful protection. The church guaranteed that those who sought refuge in holy places would not be harmed or removed, but it was also essentially a prison, and the Queen's decision to flee there demonstrated her fear of what Richard might do. Richard arrived in London with the young king in early May. Edward III was taken to the Tower of London, which served as both a royal palace and a prison. It was traditional for monarchs to stay at the Tower before their coronations, so this move initially seemed unremarkable. Richard established himself as protector and began to govern in Edward III's name. For several weeks, preparations continued for Edward's coronation, scheduled for late June. Richard appeared to be fulfilling his role as a protector faithfully. He governed competently, made appropriate appointments, and worked to maintain stability during the transition from one reign to another. But beneath this appearance of normalcy, a complex plot was unfolding. On the 16th of June, Richard sent a message to the Queen in sanctuary, requesting that she release her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, so that the boy could join his brother in the Tower. The stated reason was that Edward needed company, and that his brother should be with him for the coronation ceremonies. After initially refusing, the Queen eventually agreed, perhaps convinced by assurances of the boy's safety, or perhaps simply recognizing that she had no real power to resist. The young Duke of York, just 10 years old, was taken to the Tower to join his 12-year-old brother. The two boys were now together in the Tower, nominally as royal princes awaiting a coronation, but effectively as prisoners under their uncle's control. What the boys thought about their situation, whether they understood the danger they might be in, whether they trusted their Uncle Richard or feared him, these questions have no answers. They were children caught in a political crisis beyond their understanding. On the 22nd of June, a sermon was preached in London making an extraordinary claim. The preacher, Ralph Shah, announced that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The grounds for this claim were that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before his secret marriage to Elizabeth. A pre-contract, under medieval law, was as binding as marriage itself, which meant that Edward's later marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous and void. The implications of this claim were staggering. If Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, then all their children were illegitimate. Edward V was not the rightful king. His brother Richard was not a prince of the blood royal. Edward IV's other daughters were not princesses. The entire line of succession through Edward III's children was eliminated. And who was the rightful heir to the throne if Edward III's children were illegitimate? Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the last legitimate son of Richard, Duke of York. Richard was the rightful king of England. 3 days after this sermon, a document called Titulus Regius was presented to an assembly of lords and commons. This document, formally declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate and Richard the rightful king, was accepted by those present. Whether they truly believed the claims about Edward's marriage, or whether they were intimidated by Richard's control of the military and the two young princes, is a question historians still debate. On the 26th of June, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was proclaimed King Richard III of England. He was crowned on the 6th of July in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was designed to demonstrate legitimacy, to show that Richard's assumption of the throne was legal and proper, supported by law and by the lords of the realm. But the two young princes remained in the Tower. Edward, who had been King Edward V for less than 3 months, and his brother Richard were still alive, but no longer seen in public. Over the following weeks and months, they were seen less and less frequently. By the autumn of 1483, they had disappeared entirely from public view. What happened to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the boys who became known to history as the princes in the Tower, remains one of English history's greatest mysteries. The uncertainty around their fate has spawned centuries of speculation, accusation, and debate. But what is certain is that their disappearance fundamentally undermined Richard III's kingship and contributed directly to his ultimate downfall. The boys were last reliably seen in the late summer of 1483. Some sources report them playing in the Tower gardens, shooting at targets with their bows, appearing for a time to be simply royal children, kept in luxury during uncertain times. But gradually, these sightings became less frequent. The boys were seen in windows less often. Reports of them stopped entirely. Rumours began almost immediately. By the autumn of 1483, there were whispers in London and beyond that the princes were dead. Some said they had been smothered in their sleep, others that they had been drowned or poisoned. The rumours varied in details but agreed on the essential points. The boys were dead, and Richard was responsible. Richard III never produced the princes in public after becoming king. This silence is perhaps the most damning evidence against him. If the boys had been alive, Richard could have ended the rumours immediately by showing them. He could have explained where they were and why they remained in custody. His failure to do so strongly suggests that he could not produce them because they were dead. But did Richard order their deaths? The question has divided historians for centuries. The case against Richard is circumstantial but powerful. He had the motive. The boys, even if declared illegitimate, represented a potential threat to his rule. He had the opportunity. The boys were in the Tower under his control, and he had shown himself willing to take extreme measures to secure power, as demonstrated by his arrest of the Woodvilles and his seizure of the throne. Yet there is no direct evidence of Richard ordering the princes' deaths. No contemporary source names him explicitly as responsible. The detailed accusations of murder would come later, primarily from Tudor historians writing under the regime that overthrew Richard and who had every reason to paint him as a villain. The most famous account, by Sir Thomas More, was written decades after the events and relied on sources that may have been unreliable or biased. Alternative theories have been proposed. Some historians suggest that the princes died of natural causes. Disease was common in medieval London, and children were particularly vulnerable. Others propose that they survived Richard's reign and were killed later by Henry Tudor, who would also have seen them as threats. A few scholars have even suggested that the boys might have survived entirely, perhaps smuggled out of England and raised in obscurity. Most historians, however, believe that the princes were murdered in the autumn of 1483 and that Richard III was, at minimum, complicit in their deaths, even if he did not personally give the order. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The timing of their disappearance coincides with Richard's need to eliminate potential challenges to his rule, and his refusal to produce them when doing so would have silenced his critics suggests that he could not. In 1674, workmen renovating the Tower of London discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. The location matched a claim made by Sir Thomas More that the princes had been buried at the stair foot, meetly deep. The bones were examined and determined to be those of 2 children roughly matching the ages of the princes. King Charles II ordered that the bones be interred in Westminster Abbey, in an urn designed by Christopher Wren and placed in the Henry VII Chapel. An inscription on the urn identifies the remains as those of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined again by medical experts, who concluded that they likely were the remains of 2 boys aged roughly 12 and 10, consistent with the princes' ages. However, modern forensic techniques have never been applied to the bones. The royal family has refused requests to exhume them for DNA testing, arguing that they have been consecrated as Christian burials and should not be disturbed. This decision has frustrated historians who believe that modern science could potentially confirm whether the bones are those of the princes and, possibly, provide information about how they died. For Richard III, whether or not he directly ordered the princes' deaths, the disappearance of his nephews was a political disaster. The rumors of murder spread rapidly and damaged his reputation irreparably. Many who might have been willing to accept Richard's claim to the throne based on the illegitimacy of Edward IV's children found themselves unable to support a king suspected of murdering children. The stain of the prince's disappearance would never wash away. Richard III's reign, which lasted only 26 months, was dominated by the consequences of his seizure of power and the disappearance of the princes. From the moment of his coronation, Richard faced opposition and rebellion. The unity he needed to govern effectively never materialized, and he spent his brief time as king fighting to maintain the crown he had taken. The first major crisis came in October 1483, just months after Richard's coronation. A widespread rebellion erupted across southern England. The revolt was remarkable for bringing together former enemies, Yorkists who had been loyal to Edward IV, and Lancastrians who had opposed the York family for decades. They were united by a single goal: removing Richard III from the throne. Leading the rebellion was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had been one of Richard's chief supporters during the coup against Edward V. Buckingham's betrayal was shocking. He had stood by Richard during the seizure of power, had served as Lord High Steward at Richard's coronation, and had been lavishly rewarded with lands and offices. Yet within months, he was in open rebellion. The reasons for Buckingham's betrayal remain unclear. Some sources suggest he was horrified when he learned of the prince's fate. Others that he had his own ambitions for the throne. Buckingham himself was descended from Edward III and had a distant claim to the crown. Perhaps he believed he could use the chaos following Richard's usurpation to advance his own interests. Coordinating with Buckingham was a more dangerous opponent, Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne through the Lancastrian line, who had been living in exile in Brittany for years. Tudor represented the last hope of the Lancastrian cause, and the rebels planned to support his invasion in conjunction with the uprisings across southern England. The plan was for multiple simultaneous rebellions to overwhelm Richard's forces, while Henry Tudor landed with an army from Brittany. But the coordination failed. Heavy autumn rains flooded the rivers, preventing Buckingham's forces from joining the other rebels. Henry Tudor's invasion fleet was scattered by storms and forced to turn back. Richard, meanwhile, moved quickly and decisively to crush the scattered uprisings. Buckingham was captured while trying to flee and was executed in early November. The rebellion collapsed without achieving any of its objectives. Richard's swift response had preserved his throne, but the rebellion had revealed how weak his position truly was. Large parts of England had been willing to rise against him, and the only thing that saved his crown was good luck with the weather and poor coordination among his enemies. Richard spent the following months trying to strengthen his position. He made a royal progress through the realm, showing himself to his subjects and attempting to win their loyalty. He worked to reform the administration of justice and passed legislation designed to benefit common people, measures that earned him some popularity, but could not overcome the suspicion that surrounded his kingship. The king also dealt with personal tragedy during this period. His son, Edward of Middleham, died in April 1484 at the age of 10. The boy had been Richard's only legitimate child, his heir, the person who would have continued his line. Edward's death was devastating personally and, politically, Richard now had no heir, which raised the question of who would succeed him if he died. Richard initially named another nephew, Edward, Earl of Warwick, as his heir. Warwick was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother who had been executed for treason years earlier. But Warwick was a troubled young man, possibly mentally disabled, and few saw him as a suitable future king. The succession remained unsettled, adding to the instability of Richard's reign. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor was preparing for another invasion attempt. From his exile in France, Tudor built alliances, gathered resources, and worked to present himself as the solution to England's problems. He made a crucial promise. If he won the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and the sister of the disappeared princes. This promise united the Yorkist opponents of Richard with the Lancastrian supporters of Tudor, creating a powerful coalition. Richard was aware of Tudor's preparations and spent much of 1484 and early 1485 preparing for the expected invasion. He positioned troops along the coast, established a network of informers to warn him of Tudor's landing, and worked to ensure the loyalty of key nobles. But his position grew increasingly precarious as more nobles defected or declared their neutrality, unwilling to commit to a king they suspected of murdering children. In March 1485, Richard's wife, Queen Anne Neville, died. She had been in poor health for months, and some contemporaries suggested that Richard had actually poisoned her because he wanted to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, to prevent her marriage to Henry Tudor. The rumour was almost certainly false. Richard publicly denied it and appeared genuinely grieved by Anne's death. But the fact that such rumours could gain traction showed how damaged Richard's reputation had become. By summer 1485, everyone knew that Henry Tudor's invasion was imminent. The only questions were where he would land and whether Richard could defeat him. Richard established his base at Nottingham, a central location from which he could respond to an invasion anywhere on the English coast. He summoned nobles to be ready to join him with their forces when the call came. And he waited. On the 7th of August, 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire, Wales. He brought with him a small force of perhaps 2,000 men, mostly French mercenaries. It was a modest army with which to challenge for the throne of England, but Tudor was counting on receiving reinforcements as he marched inland. Tudor's choice of Wales as his landing site was strategic. He was partly Welsh by ancestry through his grandfather Owen Tudor, and he hoped that Welsh nobles would rally to him. As he marched inland, this hope was partially fulfilled. Rhys ap Thomas, a powerful Welsh lord, joined Tudor with his forces. Other Welsh nobles contributed men and supplies. The rebel army grew larger as it moved east. Richard received news of the landing on the 11th of August. He immediately issued summons for his supporters to join him, then began moving his forces southward to intercept Tudor. Richard could field a significantly larger army than Tudor, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men compared to Tudor's 5,000. On paper, Richard's military superiority was clear, but two crucial nobles had not committed their forces to Richard: Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, and his brother William Stanley commanded substantial forces but claimed to be neutral in the conflict. Lord Stanley was in an awkward position. He was married to Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, which made him Tudor's stepfather. Richard had tried to ensure Stanley's loyalty by taking his son hostage, but Stanley made excuses for not joining Richard's army. Richard knew that the Stanley's neutrality was dangerous. If they joined Tudor during the battle, they could tip the balance against him. But Richard also couldn't afford to alienate them completely before the battle by, for example, executing Stanley's son. The king had to hope that Stanley's self-interest would keep him from actively supporting Tudor. The two armies converged near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. On the evening of August 21st, they camped within sight of each other, preparing for battle the next day. Richard spent the night at an inn in Leicester. According to later accounts, he slept poorly, tormented by nightmares. Shakespeare would famously dramatize this night, having the ghosts of all Richard's victims, including the princes in the tower, appear to curse him before the battle. The morning of August 22nd dawned to find Richard's army positioned on Ambion Hill, a naturally strong defensive position. Tudor's smaller force was positioned below, facing the challenge of attacking uphill against a larger army. The Stanley forces were positioned to the side, watching but not yet committed to either side. The battle that would determine England's future was about to begin. The fighting began with archery exchanges, each side trying to weaken the other before the main engagement. Then Tudor's forces advanced up the hill, beginning the brutal close-quarters combat that characterized medieval battles. For a time, the battle was evenly matched despite Richard's numerical advantage. Tudor's mercenaries were experienced soldiers, and the Duke of Oxford, commanding Tudor's forces, was a skilled general. But Richard held a significant advantage in position and numbers, and gradually the royal forces began to push Tudor's army back. If the battle had continued on its current course, Richard would likely have won. But Richard, watching from his position and seeing an opportunity, made a fateful decision. Henry Tudor was visible on the battlefield, positioned with a small bodyguard somewhat separate from his main force. Richard, either out of tactical calculation or desperation, or perhaps a desire to personally end the challenge to his rule, decided to lead a cavalry charge directly at Tudor. If he could kill Tudor, the rebellion would collapse immediately regardless of how the rest of the battle was going. Richard gathered his household knights and most loyal supporters and charged down the hill toward Tudor's position. The charge was fearless and initially successful. Richard's force smashed through Tudor's guards, and the king himself was fighting within yards of his rival. Contemporary accounts describe Richard fighting with exceptional courage, killing Tudor's standard-bearer and coming close to reaching Tudor himself. But at this crucial moment, the Stanleys made their choice. Sir William Stanley led his forces into the battle. On Tudor's side, they crashed into Richard's cavalry charge from the side, surrounding the king and his supporters. Outnumbered and cut off from the rest of his army, Richard fought on. Chroniclers would later write that someone called out to him to flee, that horses were available for his escape. Richard allegedly replied, "I will not budge a foot. I will die King of England." In the melee that followed, Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, was killed. Multiple wounds to his head suggest he lost his helmet during the fighting and was cut down by repeated blows. His body fell to the muddy ground of Bosworth Field, and with it fell the dynasty that had ruled England for more than 3 centuries. After the battle, Richard's body was stripped naked and slung over a horse, then carried to Leicester for public display. The humiliation was deliberate. Henry Tudor wanted everyone to see that Richard was dead, that there could be no doubt about the outcome of the battle. The body was displayed in Leicester for several days. allowing anyone who wished to see that the previous king was truly dead. Richard was buried in the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester with minimal ceremony. For a king of England, even a defeated one, the burial was remarkably humble. No grand tomb was erected, no monument marked his resting place. Henry Tudor was making a point. Richard's reign had been illegitimate, a usurpation, and his death was not to be honoured as that of a true king. Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII on October 30th, 1485. He worked quickly to establish his legitimacy, understanding that his claim to the throne was weak by medieval standards. His ancestry included Lancastrian blood through his mother, but it came through an illegitimate line that had been specifically excluded from the succession. His real claim was conquest. He had won the throne on the battlefield. To strengthen his position, Henry fulfilled his promise to marry Elizabeth of York. The wedding took place in January 1486, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York in a single royal family. Henry adopted as his symbol the Tudor rose, combining the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster. The symbolism was clear. The civil wars were over. The rival families united. A new dynasty begun. But Henry still had to deal with the surviving members of the York family. Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, was imprisoned in the Tower. He was only 10 years old, but his royal blood made him a potential rallying point for Yorkist opposition. Henry kept him imprisoned for years before eventually executing him in 1499 on dubious charges of treason. With Warwick's death, the legitimate male line of the Plantagenets became extinct. The fate of the princes in the Tower remained a mystery. Henry VII never produced them, which strongly suggests they had died during Richard III's reign. But Henry also never officially declared them dead or explained what had happened to them. This silence allowed rumours and pretenders to flourish, creating ongoing challenges to Tudor rule. The most famous pretenders were Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. Simnel claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, though the real Warwick was imprisoned in the Tower. Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the missing princes. Both pretenders attracted support from Yorkist sympathisers and foreign powers. Both were eventually captured and executed, though Henry showed surprising mercy to Simnel, who ended his life working in the royal kitchens. Richard III's reputation suffered enormously in the years after his death. Tudor historians painted him as a villain, a usurper who had murdered his way to power and killed innocent children to keep it. The most influential of these accounts was Sir Thomas More's History of King Richard III, which portrayed Richard as a physically deformed, morally corrupt monster. More's Richard was hunchbacked, paranoid, and utterly evil. This negative portrayal reached its apex in William Shakespeare's play Richard III, written more than a century after Richard's death. Shakespeare's Richard is one of literature's great villains, charming but utterly immoral, willing to commit any crime to gain power. The play's Richard murders his brother George, though historically this was Edward IV's doing, orders the deaths of the princes, and commits numerous other murders before meeting his deserved end at Bosworth. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Shakespeare's famous line has Richard desperately seeking to flee the battlefield, though this contradicts the historical evidence suggesting Richard fought to the death. But Shakespeare was writing to entertain Elizabethan audiences and to please Tudor monarchs. Historical accuracy was less important than dramatic impact and political appropriateness. For centuries, this negative image of Richard III dominated historical understanding. He was the archetypal wicked uncle, the child killer, the tyrant who got his just deserts. But starting in the 20th century, some historians began to reassess Richard's reign more carefully. They pointed out that much of the negative evidence came from Tudor sources, with every reason to vilify him. They noted that Richard's actual governance showed competence and concern for justice. They questioned whether the prince's deaths could be definitively attributed to him. This revisionist view led to the formation of the Richard III Society, an organization dedicated to reassessing Richard's reputation and promoting research into his actual reign, rather than Tudor propaganda. The society argued that Richard has been unfairly maligned, that he was no worse than other medieval monarchs, and that his vilification served Tudor political purposes rather than reflecting historical reality. The debate over Richard III took a dramatic turn in 2012. Archaeologists working in Leicester, guided by historical research and modern technology, excavated a site where the Greyfriars Church had stood. Beneath a modern parking lot, they discovered a skeleton that showed evidence of trauma consistent with death in battle, including a fatal blow to the skull. The spine showed severe scoliosis, a curved spine that would have created the appearance of physical deformity. DNA testing confirmed what the location and wound suggested. This was Richard III. After more than 500 years, the last Plantagenet king had been found. The discovery generated enormous public interest and reignited debates about Richard's character and reign. The curved spine confirmed that Richard did have a physical deformity, though not the severe hunchback described by Tudor propagandists. In 2015, Richard III was reburied with full ceremony in Leicester Cathedral. The reburial service was attended by members of the royal family and was broadcast internationally. Richard was finally receiving the formal burial appropriate for a king of England. More than 5 centuries after his death, the ceremony represented a kind of rehabilitation, acknowledging Richard as a legitimate king regardless of the controversies of his reign. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England since 1154, ended on that bloody field at Bosworth. The 3 centuries of Plantagenet rule had seen England transformed. The Magna Carta signed, Parliament established, great wars fought with France and Scotland, magnificent castles and cathedrals built. The English language emerged from the shadow of French to become the language of government and literature. The Plantagenets had given England some of its greatest kings: Henry II with his legal reforms, Edward III the lawgiver, Edward III, and his son the Black Prince who had won glory in France. They had also given England some of its worst: John, who lost the French territories, Edward II, who was deposed and murdered, Richard II, whose tyranny led to his overthrow, and finally Richard III, whose usurpation destroyed the dynasty. But it was the 3 York brothers whose story brought the dynasty to its end, who best illustrated both the glory and the tragedy of Plantagenet rule. Edward IV had been everything a medieval king should be: tall, handsome, brave in battle, successful in war, capable in governance. He had won his throne through his own efforts, had restored peace after years of civil war, had fathered a new generation of royal children. He should have founded a lasting dynasty. Yet Edward's personal choices, his secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, his favoritism toward her family, his execution of his brother George, created the conditions for disaster. His death at 40, his body worn out by years of excess, left behind vulnerable children who would become victims of the power struggles he had tried to prevent. George, Duke of Clarence, represented the dangers of ambition without judgment. Tall, handsome, and charming like his brother Edward, George had every advantage except the patience to accept his position as second son. His constant betrayals, his switching sides in the Civil War, his paranoid behavior after his wife's death, all stemmed from a fundamental inability to accept that he would never be king. His death in the wine barrel, whether literal truth or symbolic legend, seemed a fitting end for a man whose appetites exceeded his abilities, and Richard III, loyal brother who became usurping uncle, capable administrator who became suspected child murderer. Richard's tragedy was that he might have been an effective king if he had come to the throne legitimately. His governance showed competence. His reforms demonstrated concern for justice. His courage in battle was undeniable. But his seizure of power from his nephew and the disappearance of the princes created a stain that no amount of good governance could remove. The three brothers destroyed what their father had died trying to achieve. Richard, Duke of York, had claimed the throne for his family based on his superior hereditary right. He had died in the attempt, but his eldest son had succeeded where he failed. Edward IV had made the Yorkist claim to the throne a reality, had defeated the Lancastrians and established his family as England's rulers. But the seeds of destruction were within the family itself. The brothers' conflicts, Edward's favoritism that enraged George's betrayals that forced Edward to execute him, Richard's usurpation that destroyed Edward's children. These internal conflicts achieved what external enemies could not. The Lancastrians had been defeated at Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, but the York family defeated itself through fraternal conflict and ambition. The Wars of the Roses, which had begun as a conflict between two branches of the Plantagenet family, York and Lancaster, ended with York destroying itself from within. The final battle at Bosworth was Yorkist against Yorkist. Richard III against Yorkists who had supported Edward IV and could not accept Richard's usurpation. The White Rose fought against the White Rose, and in that fratricide, the dynasty died. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth was as much a victory by default as a conquest. Richard III had been defeated not just by Tudor's army, but by his own actions, by the opposition his usurpation had created among those who should have been his natural supporters. The Plantagenet dynasty fell not because it was weak, but because it tore itself apart. The Tudor dynasty that followed would last for more than a century, producing monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, who would fundamentally reshape England. But the Tudors never forgot that their claim to the throne was weak, that they had won power through battlefield victory rather than clear hereditary right. This insecurity led them to ruthlessly eliminate potential Plantagenet rivals and to promote historical narratives that emphasize the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and the peace that Tudor rule brought. Yet the Plantagenet legacy endured beyond the dynasty itself. The legal and governmental structures they had created, Parliament, common law, the basic framework of royal administration, continued under the Tudors and beyond. The castles and cathedrals built during the Plantagenet centuries remained as monuments to their power and ambition. And the stories of the Plantagenet kings, their victories and defeats, their wisdom and folly, their glory and their tragedy, became part of England's national mythology. The tale of the three York brothers, of Edward, George, and Richard, became the most famous story from the Plantagenet era. It had everything that makes history compelling: ambition and betrayal, loyalty and murder, love and hatred, great victories and terrible defeats. It showed how family bonds could be both the strongest of ties and the most dangerous of vulnerabilities. Most importantly, the story of the three brothers offered a lesson about power that each generation must learn anew. That power without wisdom leads to destruction. That ambition without restraint consumes those who harbor it. That family conflicts can destroy even the mightiest of dynasties. The Plantagenets had ruled England for over 300 years, but three brothers, in less than 3 decades, brought that rule to an end. As the sun set over Bosworth Field on that August evening in 1485, the soldiers and nobles began the grim work of looting the dead and caring for the wounded. Somewhere in the mud and blood lay the body of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king. Around him lay hundreds of other bodies. Men who had died in what would be remembered as the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor, the victor, stood on a small hill surveying the battlefield. Someone brought him the crown that had been found beneath a hawthorn bush, where it had fallen from Richard's head during the battle. The crown was battered and muddy, but still recognizable as the circlet of royalty. Lord Stanley, who had played such a crucial role in the battle's outcome by switching sides at the critical moment, placed the crown on Henry's head. It was a symbolic moment, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The crown passed from the Plantagenet dynasty to the Tudor dynasty, from medieval to early modern England, from a world of feudal loyalties to a world of stronger central authority. The Wars of the Roses, which had devastated England for 30 years, were finally over, but the memory of the Plantagenets, and especially the memory of the three brothers whose conflicts had destroyed them, would live on. Their story would be told and retold, dramatized by Shakespeare, debated by historians, wondered at by generations of people fascinated by the medieval world. The dynasty was dead, but its legacy, both glorious and tragic, would endure. And somewhere beneath the streets of Leicester, in an unmarked grave, lay the last Plantagenet king, waiting 5 centuries to be found, waiting for history to pass its final judgment on his troubled reign and the dynasty that had ended with his death. Sleep now, dear listener, as the story of the 3 brothers comes to its close. Let the images drift gently through your mind. The golden warrior Edward, winning his throne at 19 and losing everything at 40. The restless George, drowning in wine and ambition. And loyal Richard, who served faithfully until ambition transformed him into England's most controversial king. 3 brothers, 3 different paths, one dynasty destroyed. The White Rose of York bloomed briefly and brilliantly in the mid-15th century, but its petals fell to the ground at Bosworth Field. The Red Rose of Lancaster, grafted onto the white, would create the Tudor Rose, a new symbol for a new age. As you drift towards sleep, remember that history is not just about kings and battles, dates and dynasties. It is about human beings, ambitious, flawed, capable of both greatness and terrible mistakes. The Plantagenet kings were not characters in a story, but real people who loved and hated, who made choices that shaped the world their descendants would inherit. Edward IV wanted to found a lasting dynasty. George wanted recognition and power beyond what fate had given him. Richard III wanted to serve loyally until circumstances made him choose between loyalty and ambition. None of them achieved what they truly desired, and their failures destroyed the family they had tried to elevate. Yet their story endures, reminding us that power is fleeting, that family bonds can be both strength and weakness, that ambition without wisdom leads to destruction. The Plantagenet dynasty ruled England for over 300 years, but it took only 3 brothers less than 3 decades to bring it all crashing down. Let these whispers from the 15th century carry you now into peaceful dreams. Let the clanking of medieval armour fade into silence, the clash of swords at Bosworth Field quiet into stillness. The brothers are at peace now, their conflicts ended, their story told. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you've enjoyed this tale of the brothers who destroyed England, I would be so grateful if you would leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical stories that will carry you gently into sleep. Until we meet again in the halls of history, sleep well, dear listener. Dream of white roses and red, of crowns won and lost, of brothers who changed the world, and rest peacefully, knowing that whatever challenges you face, they are not as complex as deciding between family loyalty and the throne of England. Good night, sweet dreamer. The Plantagenets are gone, but their story lives on in these quiet moments between waking and sleep. Rest well,